The first thing that gave them away wasn't the whispering, but the way the champagne flutes stopped moving in their hands. The string quartet was playing something light and forgettable near the manicured hedges, the late afternoon sun catching the heavy blooms of the coastal hydrangeas. I stood near the edge of the rose trellis, the saltwater breeze mixing with the cloying scent of expensive perfume, and watched the two women in the background. They wore their navy and gold silk dresses like armor, holding court near the tiered fountain, but their manners were strictly bargain bin. Their eyes were locked with laser precision on Claire. She sat on the stone bench a few yards away, the soft sage green of her dress blending almost seamlessly into the garden, her head bowed as she reviewed a catering manifest. From where I stood, 15 feet away, I could see the exact moment the gossip hit her. It was a physical impact. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the crisp line of her posture breaking. She reached up, her fingers tracing the edge of the faded, jagged scar that ran down her left cheek, a defensive, protective gesture she didn't even realize she was making. Why was the woman who had built this entire town's literary foundation from scratch sitting on the periphery of her own event, letting the local committee treat her like a liability? That was the question that had been gnawing at the back of my mind since I arrived on the coast 3 weeks ago. I didn't wait for the women to lower their voices. I set my glass on a passing silver tray, the crystal clinking sharply against the metal, and crossed the immaculate lawn. When I reached her, I knelt directly on the damp grass, ignoring the moisture seeping into the knees of my tailored trousers, and carefully took the catering manifest from her hands. They were trembling, just slightly. A single tear broke free, catching the golden hour light as it traced the uneven line of the scar she was trying so desperately to hide. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't offer a platitude. I just held the clipboard, anchoring the moment to something practical, something real. The two women behind us, one of whom was a junior committee member who had laughed entirely too hard at her own jokes during the budget meeting all summer, went dead silent. Their manufactured smiles froze into place as I turned my head to look at them over my shoulder. My first mentor in publishing, a man who had negotiated global rights deals without ever raising his blood pressure, told me once, "The strongest position is the one you never have to raise your voice to defend." "If you have structural concerns about the festival's leadership," I said, my voice barely carrying over the cellist, but carrying exactly enough weight to stop the air in their lungs, "I suggest you voice them during the board's open hours on Tuesday mornings. Speculating about my co-director's medical history at a donor event is a liability I will not allow this organization to carry. It breaches our morality clauses, and, quite frankly, it bores me." The woman in navy opened her mouth, the heavy powder on her face failing to hide the dull red flush creeping up her neck. I didn't let her speak. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, and stepped back, leaving the space open for Claire. I had shut down the threat, but I wasn't going to fight her battles for her. She didn't need a savior. She needed the floor. Claire took a breath that rattled slightly in her chest. She looked at the clipboard in my hands, grounded by the ink and the numbers, and then she lifted her chin. When she spoke, her voice was completely steady, ringing with the authority of someone who had drafted the very grants these women were drinking under. "The funding for the local literacy initiative is secured through next year," Claire said, looking directly into the eyes of the woman in navy. "If either of you would like to withdraw your sponsorships in light of my presence at the head table, you can send the formal notices to my office by 9 tomorrow morning. I will ensure the press release notes your departure accurately." They didn't say another word. The bluff had been called, and they had exactly zero leverage. They turned sharply on their heels and vanished into the dense crowd of the garden party, leaving nothing but the faint scent of gardenias and cheap cruelty dissipating in the salt air. I didn't ask if she was all right. The question was useless and insulting to her resilience. Instead, I stood beside the stone bench, my hands sliding into my pockets, and looked out over the sprawling lawn toward the harbor. We were co-leads for the Coastal Literary Festival, A shared obligation that had started as a simple agency contract and evolved into an 8-week marathon of logistics, inflated egos, and constant damage control. I was a literary agent, brought in from the city to handle the high-profile talent, manage the agency roster, and secure the rights agreements. Claire was the local anchor, the author who knew the community, the venues, and the history of the town. She also carried a history of her own, one the town refused to let her forget. The accident that had left the scar on her face and shattered her writing career had happened 4 years ago. But in a place this small, gossip had a half-life of a century. "We should get back to the office," she said quietly. Her right hand moved to her left, her thumbnail digging hard into the side of her index finger. It was a microtel I'd cataloged on day 2. She did it whenever the imposter syndrome got too loud, whenever the town's relentless undercurrent of judgment threatened to pull her under. I never mentioned it out loud. I just noted it, adjusting the environment accordingly. "Whenever you're ready," I said. We left the garden party without observing the performative ritual of saying goodbye to the host. The drive back to our shared workspace, an old converted boathouse sitting on the very edge of the harbor, was quiet. The air off the water was sharp, dense with the smell of brine and impending rain. When we walked up to the entrance, my boot hit the third wooden step of the porch. It gave a distinct, heavy, groaning creak, the sound echoing against the weathered cedar siding. It was a sound that had become the steady metronome of my days here. Every morning, that creak meant she was at the desk inside, the coffee already brewing. Every evening, it meant we were locking up together, surviving another day of bored politics. Inside, the workspace was a controlled disaster of festival brochures, author riders, and draft contracts stacked meticulously on a massive reclaimed oak table. Claire dropped her canvas bag on a chair and stood staring at a stack of unfiled invoices from the staging company. She was older than me by nearly a decade, a gap that seemed to matter to everyone in the steering committee except me. To them, I was the polished city fix-it guy, the professional shield. And she was the local tragedy who had stopped writing her own brilliant novels to organize events for other people because she didn't feel worthy of the spotlight anymore. To me, she was the smartest person in the room, the only one who actually cared about the books. "They're going to pull their funding," Claire said, leaning her weight against the edge of the table, the old wood solid beneath her hands. "The board is going to use this. They've been looking for a reason to push me out of the headline spot all month. I don't fit the pristine aesthetic they want for the national brochures. You know it." "I know that the contracts are binding," I said, pulling my laptop from my leather bag and setting it on the desk. I opened it, the screen casting a pale glow in the dimming light of the boathouse, and brought up the master ledger. "And I know that aesthetic doesn't pay the catering deposits or secure the keynote speakers." She crossed her arms, her fingers still worrying her thumb, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. "They think you're wasting your time partnering with me, that I'm dragging down your agency's reputation by association. They whisper about it every time you leave the room." She started to say something else, something deeply vulnerable about her own writing, her mouth opening, the words forming. But the old fear caught in her throat, choking the sentence before it could begin. She looked away, her jaw tight. I didn't step in to fill the silence with reassurances. I didn't offer empty platitudes about how she was wrong. I let the silence stand, heavy and honest, allowing her the dignity of her own pause. I pulled out the chair next to her, sat down, and opened the legal folder containing the master venue agreements. I didn't have an itinerary for the rest of the evening. I didn't need one. I stayed, reading the complex liability clauses in quiet companionship, letting the steady scratch of my pen on the heavy paper prove that I wasn't going anywhere. By midnight, the temperature in the boathouse had dropped sharply, the coastal damp seeping through the floorboards and settling into our bones. We were working side by side at the large oak table, the only sound the rhythmic turning of pages and the distant muffled clanking of the harbor buoys. We had to draft a completely new contingency plan for the keynote speakers. mapping out the intellectual property rights for the live-streamed panels, because the board had suddenly decided to monetize the digital feed without consulting us. This wasn't abstract, philosophical work. It was clause by clause, line by line, building an ironclad fortress of paperwork. "Read Section 4, subsection B, to me again," I said, rubbing the back of my neck where the tension had coiled into a tight knot. Claire traced the dense legal text with the end of her pen, her focus absolute. "The talent retains all broadcast rights in perpetuity, provided the festival does not distribute the recording behind a paywall without prior written consent." She frowned, pausing, her eyes scanning back up the page. "Wait, the sponsor agreements from the garden party today. The ones Harrison pushed through." She reached across the table, pulling a separate stack of papers toward her. "They require premium access gating for their VIP tier, a paywall." I stopped writing. The pen hovered over the legal pad. I looked at the contract in front of me, then at the sponsor terms she was holding. She had found it. The trap the board had deliberately laid to invalidate the author agreements. They knew the authors would walk if their IP was monetized without consent. When the festival collapsed, the board would point directly to the local management, to Claire, and frame her as incompetent for missing the conflict. It was a bureaucratic assassination attempt. "They built a contradiction into the terms," I said, my voice completely flat. I reached across the table, taking the document from her. My knuckles brushed against the back of her hand for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, practical, but a sudden drop in my stomach told me exactly how much restraint it took to pull my hand back. I focused entirely on the paper. "If we execute this, the authors pull out on day one. The festival collapses. The board blames local management." "Me," she said, the word heavy and resigned. "Do you want me to put the roster behind this? Or do you want another way out?" I asked. Claire held my gaze. "Put the roster behind it, but we do this together." "I'm drafting an amendment," I said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward me, my mind already structuring the counter leverage. "We'll force the board to sign the waiver on the paywall before Friday. If they refuse, I'll pull the agency's entire roster, every single headliner." "You can't do that," Claire said, sitting up straight, the exhaustion vanishing from her posture. "Your agency will fire you. You can't leverage your whole career, your entire professional reputation, just to keep my name on the director's list." "I don't leverage anything I'm not prepared to lose," I said, keeping my tone entirely matter-of-fact. I didn't look up from the page. I didn't want her to see the absolute certainty in my eyes, because it might feel like pressure. And I don't work with people who build traps in their contracts. We spent the next 4 hours stripping the agreements down to the studs and rebuilding them. It was a grueling, unglamorous process of cross-referencing liability clauses, intellectual property statutes, and breach of contract penalties. We didn't talk about the garden party. We talked about indemnification and broadcast rights. But every time she leaned over to point at a discrepancy, the faint scent of her shampoo, something clean and botanical, like rain on cedar, caught in my lungs. Every time I slid a corrected page toward her, the space between us felt denser, charged with a quiet, structural trust. At 3 a.m, the old radiator in the corner clanked violently, spitting out a meager wave of heat. I looked over. Claire had fallen asleep in the oversized armchair by the window, a highlighter still loosely gripped in her hand, her head resting against the cold glass. I didn't wake her. I took the heavy wool blanket from the back of the sofa, walked over, and draped it carefully over her shoulders, tucking the edges in so the draft wouldn't catch her. I wanted to touch the side of her face, right where the scar met her jawline, just to trace the history she survived. I put my hands firmly in my pockets instead, turned on my heel, and walked back to the table to finish the filings. 2 days later, a static, heavy phone call nearly derailed everything. I was standing by the window of the boathouse, watching a storm front roll in over the gray water, finalizing the travel writer for Elias Vance, our headline author and one of my oldest friends in the industry. "Julian, you need to know what's happening on the ground before you walk into the gala tomorrow," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its usual affable tone. I got a call from the festival's steering committee this morning. Not Claire, Harrison, the money people. I tightened my grip on the phone, my posture stiffening. What did they want? They asked me if I'd be comfortable with a change in local leadership before I arrive. Elias said, I told them my contract was negotiated through you, but they pressured me. Julian, they said the local director's reputation was a liability, that her history doesn't align with the prestige of the event. They told me she was unstable. They asked me to formally request her removal as a condition of my attendance, so they'd have it in writing from the top talent. My jaw locked. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was staggering. What did you say? I told them to go to hell, obviously, Elias replied. But Julian, they are making the move at the gala tomorrow night. They told me they have the votes to oust her, and they're going to present it as a mutual separation. They're going to ambush her. Thank you for telling me, Elias, I said, my voice remarkably calm given the adrenaline spiking in my chest. I'll handle it. I hung up the phone. The third porch step creaked outside, heavy and familiar. Claire walked in, carrying 2 cups of black coffee from the diner down the street. She took one look at my face, her eyes narrowing slightly, and set the cups down on the table. On the corner of her desk sat a small, slightly chipped ceramic unicorn bowl she used to hold paper clips, a ridiculous, whimsical object she had bought at a local flea market. For some reason, looking at that bowl, and realizing the board wanted to strip this space away from her, solidified my resolve into concrete. Who is that? She asked, her thumbnail immediately going to her index finger. I didn't lie to her. I didn't soften the blow. Elias, Harrison called him this morning. The board is moving to replace you at the gala tomorrow. They tried to get him to demand it in writing to give themselves cover. Claire stared at the coffee cups. The steam curled into the cold air, vanishing toward the rafters. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She just looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted. She walked over to her desk, bypassed the unicorn bowl, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out a folded, slightly torn piece of heavy stock paper. She walked back and set it on the table between us. It was a formal resignation letter. The date at the top was from 3 weeks ago. She had been carrying it this entire time, waiting for the axe to fall. I wrote this after the first planning meeting, she said, her voice hollow, devoid of the fire she had shown in the garden. When I saw how they looked at me, when I heard the whispers. I'm a small-town author who hasn't published a book in 4 years because she was in a car wreck that shattered her confidence in her face. They want prestige. Julian. I'm just a reminder of a bad stretch of highway. You are the reason this festival exists, I said, my voice perfectly level, refusing to let the emotion bleed into the syllables. Your community outreach built the entire local schedule. You secured the venues, you managed the logistics, and your agency built the credibility, she countered, looking at me, her eyes pleading with me to understand the logic. If I step down quietly, they won't fight you. You keep the roster intact, the festival succeeds. I can go back to writing, quietly. It's the logical move. Let me save face. She was waiting for me to agree. She was giving me the out, sacrificing herself to protect my professional standing. The logical move, I said, reaching out and picking up the resignation letter, is to enforce the contracts we spent 3 days rewriting. But it's your name on this, Claire, so the choice stays yours. She held my gaze for a long second, then ripped the heavy stock paper in half, the sound loud in the quiet room, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into the wastebasket by my foot. We enforce the contracts. If they want you gone, they have to break the legal framework of the festival to do it, I said, and I'm not going to let them. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Coastal Hotel, a cavernous, gilded space filled with crystal chandeliers and 100 people who preferred their literature as a status symbol rather than a discipline. I wore a dark, tailored suit. Claire wore a structured black dress that offered absolutely no apologies. When we walked in, The temperature of the room seemed to drop. The steering committee was waiting in the private alcove off the main floor, away from the prying eyes of the donors. There were 4 of them, sitting around a polished mahogany table, led by Harrison, whose wealth was matched only by his absolute certainty that he controlled the room. "Julian," Harrison said, standing up and offering a tight, perfunctory smile. He didn't look at Claire. "We were hoping to have a private word before the speeches begin, regarding the management structure moving forward. Whatever you have to say to the agency, you can say to the co-directors," I said, stepping forward and pulling out a leather chair for Claire. She sat down, her posture flawless. I remained standing right behind her, my hands resting lightly on the back of her chair, a physical barrier between her and the board. Harrison sighed, a deeply patronizing sound that grated against my nerves. "Very well. Claire, we appreciate your grassroots efforts, truly. But the scale of this event has simply outgrown a local touch. We've drafted a severance agreement." He slid a thick gray folder across the polished wood. "It's extremely generous. It allows you to step back immediately for health reasons, saving everyone any embarrassment, and lets Julian's team take full operational control. We need the optics to be pristine for the national press tomorrow." Claire looked at the gray folder. Her thumb twitched toward her index finger. I didn't speak for her. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, an immovable object at her back, waiting for her to take the room. I had built the framework, but she had to walk through the door. Claire didn't reach for the folder. She looked up at Harrison, her eyes clear and completely cold. "My health is perfectly fine, Harrison," she said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity in the quiet alcove. "And my position isn't aesthetic, it's structural." She nodded up to me. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out the finalized, notarized amendments we had drafted during that long night in the boathouse, dropping them squarely onto the gray folder. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Those are the updated, signed rights agreements for all 24 authors on the roster," I said, keeping my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "As stipulated in Section 4, all broadcast and distribution rights are entirely contingent on the current leadership structure remaining exactly as it is. If Claire Morgan is removed from her position as co-director, or if her authority is bypassed in any way, the agency's roster withdraws their intellectual property rights instantly. You won't have a festival. You'll have an empty ballroom." Harrison's face went pale, the color draining out of his cheeks. He opened the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text, searching for the loophole that didn't exist. "You can't do this. This is extortion." "It's compliance," I corrected him, stepping slightly to the side so Claire was the focal point of the room. "You wanted a professional management structure? You have one. The talent stays if the leadership stays. If you want to walk out there and explain to the national press why Elias Vance and 23 other authors walked out tonight, you can slide that gray folder back to Claire. If you want a successful festival, you will sign the amendment." The silence in the alcove was absolute. Harrison looked from the ironclad contract to me, and then, finally, he looked at Claire, really looked at her. He realized, in that exact moment, that she was not a liability to be managed. She was the one holding the keys to the entire operation. "This is absurd," one of the junior committee members muttered, but Harrison held up a hand, silencing him. Harrison took a heavy gold pen from his inside pocket, unscrewed the cap, and signed the amendment on the bottom line. He pushed the paperwork back across the table, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "Have a good evening," Claire said. She stood up smoothly, leaving their generous severance offer sitting untouched on the mahogany table. We walked out of the alcove and back into the main ballroom. The tension that had been wrapped tightly around my chest for 3 days finally broke, leaving a quiet, steady rhythm in its wake. Claire slipped through the arched doors into the hotel garden, and I followed her out beneath the rose trellis. She heard them say I could do better, a voice murmured near the terrace bar. I turned my head slightly. The two women from the garden party were standing just inside the open doors, not realizing how close we were. One of them was looking directly at me, shaking her head in theatrical disbelief. I didn't engage them this time. I didn't need to. I found Claire beside the hydrangeas, the garden lights catching the long, jagged scar on her cheek. It didn't look like a tragedy to me. It looked like survival. It looked like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stepped directly into her line of sight, blocking out the terrace doors, blocking out the noise and the judgment. "Claire." She looked up at me, the question in her eyes. "I don't want better," I said. It was the plainest, truest thing I had ever spoken in my life. A statement of absolute fact, devoid of any poetic flourish or romantic pressure. Claire's breath hitched. She didn't look down. She didn't raise her hand to hide her face. She reached out, her hand finding the lapel of my jacket, her fingers gripping the dark wool fabric. It wasn't a desperate hold. It was a decisive, active choice. She stepped closer, closing the physical gap between us, refusing to be hidden at the edge of her own event. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The way she held onto my coat, standing shoulder to shoulder with me in the open garden, was a louder declaration than any words could have been. The festival was a critical, undeniable success. The board never formally apologized, but they never challenged her authority again. They learned to respect the results, the meticulously planned logistics, and the flawless execution, which was the only currency that mattered in the end. 3 months later, the coastal harbor was quiet, the harsh winter wind freezing the salt spray against the thick glass windows of the boathouse. The festival was long over, the final accounts closed and audited. My contract with the town was officially complete. I was sitting at the heavy oak table, the radiator clanking away in the corner, reviewing a manuscript for a new client. The sound came from outside, the specific, heavy, groaning creak of the third porch step. The door opened, letting in a blast of frigid air. Claire walked in, shaking the snow from her heavy wool coat. She carried 2 cups of black coffee from the diner. She walked over to the table and set one down right next to my laptop, exactly the way she always did. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a set of heavy brass keys, and set them down on top of the manuscript pages. They were the master keys to the boathouse. Beside them, she placed the chipped ceramic unicorn bowl, filled with brand new paper clips. "I extended the lease on the building," she said, unwrapping her scarf and hanging it on the hook. "For the next 2 years, I'm starting a new book." She paused, looking at the keys, then at me. Her eyes were bright, clear, and completely free of the old shadows. "I need a literary agent who understands the value of a strong contract. And I need someone who knows how to fix that stubborn radiator when it jams." She wasn't asking me to stay because she needed rescuing. The board was handled. Her career was restarting. She was asking me to stay because she had built a life she wanted to share, and she was actively, deliberately inviting me into the center of it. I looked at the brass keys, the cold metal catching the low, gray light of the room. The strongest position isn't the one you fight for. It's the one you build, quietly and consistently, until there is no other place you belong. I picked up the keys, the weight of them solid and grounding in my palm, put them in my pocket, and pulled my chair closer to the table. I didn't need to pack my bags. I was already exactly where I was supposed to be. "Show me the first chapter," I said. Self-worth isn't earned by shrinking yourself to fit someone else's pristine aesthetic or hiding your history to make a room comfortable. It is claimed by standing firmly in the truth of your own competence. Healthy love doesn't demand you hide your scars to be chosen. It builds a fortress of consistency so secure, you finally feel safe enough to leave the armor behind and walk out into the light. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. Tell us in the comments, when did someone's quiet consistency make you feel truly chosen?